My own son called me at 2 in the morning, his voice trembling as he told me to run and hide in the attic. I dropped everything to obey him, my heart pounding out of my chest, terrified for my life. 5 minutes later, the front door of my home was battered off its hinges, and federal agents dragged me out into the freezing night in nothing but my pajamas. But the true horror was not the handcuffs biting into my wrists. It was looking across the flashing police lights and seeing my son leaning against an unmarked vehicle, casually smoking a cigarette and flashing me a cold, calculated smirk. He had set me up. My name is Harrison. I am a 65-year-old African-American man, and for most of my life I lived by a very strict set of rules. I spent over 3 decades working as a chief financial officer for a major logistics firm here in Atlanta. I made my living by crunching numbers, balancing ledgers, and predicting risks. I built a life on logic and hard work, ensuring that my family would never have to struggle the way I did when I was growing up. I bought a beautiful home in a quiet, upscale suburb. I played by the rules. I paid my taxes. I went to church. I did everything a man is supposed to do to secure a peaceful retirement. But all the financial forecasting in the world could never have prepared me for the night my entire reality was torn apart. This nightmare began just weeks after I lost my husband, Robert. Robert and I had shared 30 beautiful years together. He was a kind, gentle white man who ran a successful string of community outreach programs. We built our lives around each other. When his heart finally gave out after a long illness, my world stopped spinning. The house we had filled with so much love suddenly felt like a massive, empty tomb. I spent my days wandering the halls, touching the things he left behind, trying to remember the sound of his laugh. I was grieving, vulnerable, and completely exhausted. The only thing that kept me going was our son, Connor. Robert and I adopted Connor when he was just a little boy. We gave him everything. We paid for the best private schools in Georgia. We bought his first car. We celebrated every milestone. I loved that boy with every ounce of my soul. I was so incredibly proud of him, especially when he graduated from the academy and became an FBI agent. I remember standing there in my best suit, a proud black father crying tears of joy as my white son received his badge. I thought we had raised a man of honor, a protector. I trusted him implicitly. He was my blood in every way that mattered. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after we buried Robert. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the absolute silence of the house. Sleep was a luxury I rarely experienced anymore. I was holding a small silver picture frame, a photograph of Robert and me from our 20th anniversary trip to Charleston. My thumb traced the glass over his smiling face. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed a harsh red, displaying 2 in the morning. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet. I flinched, my heart racing. Nobody calls at 2 in the morning with good news. I reached over, fumbling in the dark, and grabbed the phone. The caller ID showed Connor. I answered immediately, fear gripping my chest. "Connor," I said, my voice thick with sleep and worry. "Is everything okay? Are you hurt?" His voice came through the speaker in a frantic, hushed whisper. "Dad, listen to me carefully. You need to get out of bed right now. They are coming for you." I sat up straight, the blankets falling to the floor. "What are you talking about? Who is coming?" "Federal agents," Connor whispered, sounding desperate. "They have a warrant, Dad. I do not have time to explain, but you are in terrible danger. You need to hide. Go to the attic. Pull the ladder up behind you and do not make a sound. Do it now, Dad. Hide." The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. Federal agents. A warrant. It made absolutely no sense. I was a retired executive. I spent my days reading historical biographies and tending to Robert's garden. I had never committed a crime in my life, but the sheer panic in my son's voice overrode all of my logic. He was the FBI agent. He knew things I did not. If he said I was in danger, I believed him without hesitation. My paternal instinct kicked in raw and blinding. I had to follow his instructions. I threw my legs over the side of the bed. My knees ached, a sharp reminder of my 65 years, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. I stood up in my thin cotton pajamas. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped the silver picture frame. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the glass splintering across the room. I wanted to stop and pick Robert up to protect his memory, but Connor's warning echoed in my ears. Go to the attic. Do it now. I stumbled out of the master bedroom and hurried down the dark hallway. My breathing was ragged and shallow. I reached the pull cord for the attic stairs, grabbing it with sweaty palms, and yanked it down. The wooden stairs unfolded with a loud creak that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent house. I started to climb, my bare feet slipping on the narrow steps. I reached the top and turned around, grabbing the edge of the ladder to pull it back up. Before I could even lift the wooden frame, the entire house shook. A massive, deafening crash erupted from the first floor. It sounded like a bomb detonating in my living room. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the heavy oak front door I had polished just last week was battered off its hinges. Heavy boots stomped across the hardwood floors. FBI, search warrant, keep your hands where we can see them. Clear the rooms, clear the rooms. Voices barked commands from every direction. Beams of intense white light sliced through the darkness of my home, casting terrifying shadows against the walls. I froze at the top of the attic stairs, completely paralyzed by terror. My chest heaved. I could not breathe. I could not think. I was an old man standing in the dark, watching my sanctuary be invaded by armed men in tactical gear. Movement upstairs, hallway. A blinding flashlight beam hit me squarely in the face. I raised my hands instinctively, shielding my eyes from the harsh glare. Show me your hands. Get down the stairs right now. Do it. Do it now. I tried to speak. Tried to tell them there was a mistake, but my throat was completely dry. I slowly descended the wooden steps, my hands raised high above my head. The moment my feet touched the hallway floor, rough hands grabbed me. They spun me around with terrifying force, slamming my chest and face against the hallway wall. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. Do not resist. Stop resisting. I am not resisting. I gasped, my face pressed against the cold drywall. Please, I am an old man. There is a mistake. They did not listen. Cold metal cuffs were slapped onto my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. They pulled the cuffs tight, forcing my arms into an unnatural, agonizing angle. My shoulders screamed in pain. Two agents grabbed me by the arms and began marching me down the hallway, dragging me like I was a violent criminal. As they pulled me down the stairs, I saw the destruction. The beautiful entryway Robert had decorated was in ruins. Framed artwork lay shattered on the floor. Books and papers were scattered everywhere. Agents were tearing through our cabinets, ripping drawers out of the kitchen island. They were dismantling the life I had built piece by piece. I was shoved out the front door and into the biting chill of the night air. The entire street was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen federal vehicles. Neighbors were standing on their lawns, clutching their robes, watching in shocked silence as the respectable retired CFO was paraded out of his home in handcuffs and pajamas. The humiliation washed over me, burning my face. I kept my head down, staring at the cold concrete of my driveway, tears of confusion and fear stinging my eyes. Keep moving. Watch your step. They shoved me toward a large, dark transport van parked at the end of the driveway. As we approached the vehicle, an agent opened the heavy metal door. I was trembling from the cold and the shock. But just before they pushed me into the back of the van, I lifted my head. There, standing under the harsh glow of a street lamp, leaning comfortably against the hood of an unmarked black SUV, was Connor. My son. My boy. He was not wearing tactical gear. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his FBI badge gleaming on his belt. He had a cigarette casually resting between his fingers. He took a long drag, exhaled a thick cloud of white smoke into the freezing air, and looked directly at me. I stopped struggling. The air left my lungs entirely. For a fleeting second, my desperate mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. He is here to save me, I thought. He called the raid, but he is here to fix the mistake. He is my son. Connor, I called out, my voice cracking, desperate for his help. Connor, tell them. Tell them it is a mistake. He did not move to help me. He did not yell for the agents to stop. Instead, he looked me dead in the eyes, tilted his head slightly, and smiled. It was not a smile of comfort. It was a cold, calculating, arrogant smirk. It was the look of a predator watching its trap snap shut on its prey. He brought the cigarette back to his lips, took another drag, and turned away, speaking calmly to the raid commander, as if they were discussing the weather. The agents shoved me hard into the back of the van. I fell onto the rigid metal bench, the doors slamming shut behind me with a loud final echo. The darkness enclosed me. I sat there in the pitch black, my handcuffed wrists throbbing in agony, shivering uncontrollably. The sirens wailed outside, signaling the end of everything I thought I knew. I closed my eyes, and the image of Connor's smirk burned itself into my mind. My son had not called to save me. He had called to make sure I hid in the attic. He wanted me to look like a guilty man trying to escape. He wanted the agents to find me cowering in the dark. He orchestrated the entire raid. The boy I had fed, clothed, and loved as my own flesh and blood had just handed me over to the wolves. The van jerked forward, pulling me away from the home Robert and I had built together. The pain in my wrists was nothing compared to the agony tearing through my heart. I was a 65-year-old widower sitting in the back of a federal transport, stripped of my dignity, my home, and my family. They thought they had broken me. They thought an old man like me would just lay down and accept defeat. But as the shock slowly began to recede, a new feeling took its place. A deep, quiet, burning clarity. I was a man who spent his life analyzing numbers, tracking discrepancies, and destroying corporate frauds. Connor had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. He thought my story ended in the back of this dark van, but he was wrong. My story was just beginning. I sat on the cold steel bench of the holding cell, shivering in my thin cotton pajamas. The air in the room was absolutely freezing, and it smelled heavily of industrial bleach and old sweat. The heavy iron door had slammed shut hours ago, but the metallic echo still rang in my ears like a death knell. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to find some shred of warmth, but the chill had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The real freezing cold came from deep inside my bones. It came from the memory of my son Connor, standing in the driveway, with that arrogant smirk on his face. He had watched me get dragged away like a common criminal. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to connect in my mind. The shock of the violent raid was slowly wearing off, and a harsh, burning clarity was taking its place. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the concrete wall, letting my mind wander back through the decades of my life. I had given everything to my family. I had poured every drop of my sweat and blood into building a foundation so strong that none of them would ever have to worry about a single thing. I thought about the grueling 80-hour work weeks. For more than 30 years, I woke up before the sun and came home long after it had set. I was a black man climbing the corporate ladder in the high-stakes financial world of Atlanta. I had to be twice as smart and work 3 times as hard just to keep my seat at the boardroom table. I missed dinners. I missed holidays. I sacrificed my youth and my health crunching numbers and managing massive corporate accounts. And I did it all willingly. I did it for Robert. When Robert had a vision to start a massive community outreach program, I did not hesitate for a second. I took my hard-earned corporate bonuses and funded his dream. I wanted him to be happy and fulfilled. But my generosity did not stop with my husband. I paid for the sprawling $1.2 million estate in the upscale suburbs where his mother Evelyn and his brother Thomas currently lived. They were conservative, proud people who never truly accepted me. They smiled politely when I handed over the checks, but their eyes always held a quiet judgment. I bought them that mansion because Robert loved his family, and I loved Robert. I paid their annual property taxes. I paid for their luxury kitchen renovations. I housed them in absolute comfort while they quietly looked down on me. And then there was Connor. We adopted him when he was just a little boy with bright eyes and a shy smile. He was a white child growing up in a home with a black father and a white father. I knew the world would be complicated for him, so I made sure he had every advantage money and love could buy. I stayed up late helping him with his homework. I cheered the loudest at his baseball games. I paid for the elite private schools so he would never fall behind. I bought him his first car on his 16th birthday. I sent him to the best college. When he told me he wanted to join the FBI, I was overflowing with pride. I paid for his specialized training programs and supported him every single step of the way. I loved that boy as if he shared my own DNA. I would have taken a bullet for him without a second thought. I gave him a premium education and a life of privilege. I never asked for anything in return except his respect and his love. Now I was sitting in a concrete box because the very boy I raised had used his federal badge to destroy me. The violent raid at my home was not a random mistake. It was a highly calculated strike. And the true motive for this ultimate betrayal had been revealed just 3 weeks earlier at Robert's funeral. The memory of that dark day flashed behind my closed eyes, bringing a fresh wave of nausea to my stomach. The funeral was held at Evelyn and Thomas's church. It was an elite conservative congregation in the wealthiest part of town. The building itself was massive with towering stained glass windows and high vaulted ceilings. The pews were packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of people from their community. I walked into that church wearing a custom black suit, carrying the unbearable weight of losing my soulmate. I expected to sit in the front row, to mourn the man I had loved for 3 decades. Instead, I walked into a deliberate ambush. When the head usher handed me the memorial program, I felt my heart stop beating. I opened the glossy booklet and read the obituary carefully printed on the back. It listed Evelyn as the grieving mother. It listed Thomas as the devoted brother. It listed Connor as the loving son. But my name was nowhere to be found. Harrison did not exist on those pages. 30 years of devotion, of shared birthdays and anniversaries, of sickness and health, had been completely erased with the simple stroke of a pen. I stood in the middle of the aisle staring at the paper while the congregation whispered all around me. The people in those pews were looking at me not with sympathy for a grieving widower, but with cold disdain. I was a total outsider at my own husband's funeral. I was a wealthy black man who was suddenly entirely unwelcome in their pristine white world. I took a seat in the second row because Evelyn had deliberately filled the entire front pew with her closest church friends. I tried to maintain my dignity. I kept my head high and focused my eyes on the beautiful flower arrangement covering Robert's casket. I told myself to be strong for him. I told myself to ignore the disrespect and focus on saying goodbye to the man who held my heart. But Evelyn was not satisfied with just erasing my name from the paper. She wanted to humiliate me completely in front of her entire community. When it was her turn to speak, she walked slowly up to the wooden podium. She adjusted her glasses and looked out over the massive crowd. She spoke beautifully about Robert's childhood, about his business ventures, and about his strong faith. And then she stopped. The church grew very quiet. She slowly raised her hand and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. The entire church went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me, sitting alone in the second row. Evelyn leaned close to the microphone, and her voice echoed sharply through the massive sanctuary. She told the crowd that her son had lost his way for many years. She said he was trapped in a trivial, unholy sham of a marriage. She proclaimed that it was a lifestyle that God does not recognize and that her family never truly supported. But today she announced they would reclaim his soul. She said they would wash away the mistakes of the past 30 years and bring him back into the light. I could not breathe. My own mother-in-law was standing over my husband's dead body, invalidating my entire existence. She was reducing 3 decades of profound love and partnership to a dirty sin. I looked toward the front row. I saw Thomas sitting there nodding in agreement with a smug look on his face. Then I looked at Connor. My boy was sitting right next to Thomas, looking down at his expensive shoes, completely silent. My own son did not stand up to defend me. He let them tear my heart out and stomp on it in front of a massive crowd. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked down the center aisle with every ounce of pride I could muster. I left the sanctuary and went to the private family reception room down the hall to wait. I knew they would come for me. I knew the public humiliation was only the beginning of their vicious plan. 10 minutes after the funeral service ended, Thomas and Evelyn walked into the private room. They locked the door behind them. The fake tears of a grieving mother and brother were completely gone. Their faces were hard and demanding. Thomas did not waste any time with pleasantries. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the table right in front of me. He looked me right in the eye and said, "You need to sign these right now, Harrison. You are going to sign over the rest of Robert's estate to us today. We want the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the permanent deed to our house. You are walking away from this family with nothing." I looked at the papers and then I looked at the people I had financially supported for decades. The sheer audacity of their demand was breathtaking. They had just publicly humiliated me in the sanctuary, and now they expected me to blindly hand over the immense wealth I had built with my own 2 hands. I stood up and looked down at Thomas. My voice was dangerously calm, but it carried the weight of 30 years of hard corporate negotiations. I told them absolutely not. I reminded them that I was still the legal executor of Robert's entire estate. I told them that every single dime they had and every luxury they enjoyed was paid for by my hard work and my intelligence. I warned them that if they pushed me, I would legally sell the $1.2 million estate out from under them and leave them homeless on the street. Evelyn gasped loudly and clutched her chest, acting like I had physically struck her. She called me a monster. But Thomas just smiled. It was a nasty, confident smile that I will never forget. He leaned close to me and pointed his finger at my chest. He said, "You are a fool, Harrison. You do not belong here, and you have no real power over us. If you do not sign these papers, you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life. We will take everything from you by force if we have to." I walked out of that room thinking his words were just the empty threats of a greedy, grieving man. I went home to my empty house to mourn my husband in peace. I severely underestimated their evil. I underestimated how far they would go to protect their elite lifestyle and their stolen wealth. Sitting here in this freezing holding cell with my wrists bruised from the handcuffs, I finally understood the terrifying truth. Thomas had not made an empty threat that day at the church. He had made a promise. And he used my own son, the federal agent, to deliver on that exact promise. The violent raid in the middle of the night, the shattered door, the handcuffs, the public humiliation in front of my neighbors, it was all their calculated retaliation. They wanted to break my spirit. They wanted to lock me away in the federal system so they could easily steal everything I had built. They thought, because I was old and grieving, I would just roll over and surrender my life to them. They thought I would be too weak to fight back against the government and their elite connections. They thought wrong. I opened my eyes and looked at the heavy iron door of my cell. The cold concrete no longer bothered me. The sadness of losing my son to their corruption was fading away. In its place was a sharp, focused anger. They had awakened a man who knew how to dismantle empires. I survived the corporate world by finding the hidden flaws in the system, and I was going to use every single skill I possessed to destroy them. They wanted a war over my wealth. I was going to give them a war that would leave them with absolutely nothing. The interrogation room was exactly as cold and unforgiving as you would imagine. I was sitting on a hard metal chair bolted to the linoleum floor, shivering in the thin cotton pajamas I had been wearing when they dragged me out of my home. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum, casting harsh shadows across the gray concrete walls. My wrists ached where the steel cuffs had bitten into my skin during the ride over. For hours, I was left alone in that freezing box. They wanted to break me down. They wanted the cold, the isolation, and the sheer shock of the midnight raid to strip away my dignity. They wanted me to feel like a helpless old man. But as the hours ticked by, the initial panic that had paralyzed me in the back of the transport van slowly began to evaporate. I am a 65-year-old African-American man. I survived the civil rights struggles of my youth, and I fought tooth and nail to climb the ranks of corporate America, to become a chief financial officer in Atlanta. I spent 30 years swimming with sharks in tailored suits, analyzing risks and managing millions of dollars. I had built a thick skin. I took a deep breath of the stale air and forced my heart rate to slow down. I needed a clear head. Finally, the heavy iron door swung open. 2 federal agents walked into the room. They were both young white men with sharp haircuts, crisp suits, and arrogant postures. They looked at me with the kind of smug certainty that only comes from men who believe they hold your entire life in the palm of their hands. The lead agent did not bother to introduce himself. He walked straight to the metal table and slammed a massive stack of thick manila folders down with a deafening thud. "We have you dead to rights, Harrison," the lead agent said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You can drop the innocent grieving widower act right now. We know exactly what you did." I looked at the heavy folders and then up at his face. I kept my voice steady and completely calm. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I buried my husband 3 weeks ago. I am a retired executive. I have never committed a crime in my life." The second agent scoffed, pulling a metal chair out and scraping it loudly across the floor before sitting down. He crossed his arms and stared at me. "That is a beautiful story," he said, mocking my tone. "The devoted husband." But the digital paper trail tells a very different story. It tells the story of a greedy man who realized his husband was dying and decided to clean out the accounts before the ink on the death certificate was even dry. The lead agent opened the first folder and began tossing documents across the table. They spread out before me like a deck of poisonous cards. He pointed a sharp finger at the top page. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand theft. According to these records, you systematically drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from Robert's private pension fund over the last 6 months. I stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. Robert's pension. That money was secured in a locked trust intended to cover his ongoing medical expenses and eventually pay off the remaining mortgage on the estate where his mother Evelyn and his brother Thomas lived. But that was not all. The agent tossed another stack of papers in front of me. "And here is the real kicker," he continued, his voice filled with disgust. "You did not just rob your dying husband. You robbed his church. We have the wire transfers showing that you diverted nearly $250,000 from the conservative community charity fund that Robert managed. You funneled the charity donations directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." The sheer insult of the accusation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Robert had dedicated his life to that charity. It was his proudest achievement. To accuse me of stealing from the very cause my husband championed was a sickening violation of his memory. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the cold metal table. "That is a lie," I stated firmly. "I never touched his pension, and I certainly never touched that charity fund. Every financial move I made for our household was completely transparent." The second agent leaned in, tapping his finger against a series of printed spreadsheets. "The numbers do not lie, Harrison. We have the bank routing numbers, we have the timestamps, and most importantly, we have your digital signatures on every single transfer authorization form. You thought because you were a fancy corporate CFO, you could hide your tracks in the digital ether. But you got sloppy. We have the IP logs proving these transactions were executed from your personal home network and from your personal laptop." They slid the authorization forms toward me. I looked down at the bottom of the pages. There, in black and white, was my exact digital signature. It was flawless. It matched the encrypted signature file I used for all my corporate approvals. The IP logs listed on the forensic report showed my exact home address and my specific router identification. For a brief, terrifying second, a wave of doubt washed over me. The evidence looked incredibly real. It was packaged with formal bank headers and official audit stamps. The agents sat back in their chairs, watching my eyes scan the documents, clearly waiting for me to break down and confess. They thought I was just an old man, overwhelmed by the complexity of cybercrimes, but they forgot one crucial detail. I spent my entire career managing corporate audits, analyzing forensic accounting data, and tracking digital assets across international borders. Numbers were my native language. I did not panic. I put on my invisible corporate armor, and I began to read the documents not as a frightened suspect, but as a chief financial officer. I looked closely at the timestamps on the wire transfers. The first transfer from Robert's pension was dated 4 months ago at 3:15 in the afternoon. I closed my eyes and accessed my memory. 4 months ago, at 3:15 in the afternoon, I was sitting in the intensive care unit, holding Robert's hand, while he underwent a grueling round of dialysis. I was not at home on my laptop. The second transfer was stamped at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. I am an early riser, but I am never at my computer at 4 in the morning. Then I turned my attention to the forensic IP logs the agents were so proud of. The digital footprints that supposedly tied me to the offshore accounts. I scrutinized the architecture of the data packets printed on the page. As I read the routing sequences and the encryption keys, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The formatting of the IP logs was strangely rigid. The data strings did not look like standard commercial banking outputs. The metadata tags on the digital signatures were sequenced using a very specific encrypted hash protocol. I had seen this exact protocol before. 10 years ago, my logistics firm was contracted by the federal government to audit supply chain vulnerabilities. I had to coordinate directly with federal cybersecurity teams. I knew what commercial tracking software looked like, and I knew what federal surveillance software looked like. The IP logs printed on the papers in front of me were too perfect. They lacked the random, fragmented packet loss you see in typical residential internet traffic. They were generated. They were fabricated using a highly classified internal federal software system designed to create airtight digital footprints for sting operations. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. The air in the interrogation room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I stared blindly at the paper, my hands beginning to tremble, not from fear, but from a devastating, heartbreaking revelation. A teenager hacking from a basement could not generate these federal audit logs. A greedy brother-in-law like Thomas did not have the clearance to access this level of encrypted architecture. There was only one person in my entire life who had intimate access to my personal digital signature, knew the exact IP address of my home router, and held the top-secret security clearance required to use federal software to fabricate a cybercrime. Connor, my son. The boy I had taught how to ride a bicycle. The boy I had stayed up all night nursing through childhood fevers. The boy I had proudly watched take his oath as an FBI agent. Connor had done this. He had used his badge and his federal clearance to systematically construct a fake trail of financial crimes against me. He had planted the digital signatures. He had generated the fake IP logs using FBI internal software to make it look like I was stealing from his dying father and his grandmother's church. He had built an airtight federal case out of thin air, deliberately weaponizing his own agency to destroy my life. I sat completely frozen, staring at the documents, as the monstrous reality of his betrayal crushed my soul. The night of the raid, the 2 a.m. phone call telling me to hide in the attic. It all made perfect, sickening sense now. Connor did not call to warn me. He called to manipulate me. He knew that if the raiding agents found me hiding in the dark, it would immediately establish my guilt. It would frame me as a desperate criminal attempting to evade justice. He had orchestrated the entire theatrical raid just to ensure I was humiliated and locked away without bail. But the financial forgery was only one layer of the betrayal. The emotional and psychological depth of what Connor had done was a profound, unforgivable violence. I am a black man in America. Connor is a white man. I adopted him and loved him, shielding him from a world that is inherently designed to favor him. I gave him my name, my wealth, and my unconditional devotion. And how did he repay me? When his wealthy white conservative biological family, his grandmother Evelyn and his uncle Thomas, demanded that I surrender my estate, Connor chose them. He chose their pristine country club world over the black father who wiped his tears and paid for his college. Evelyn and Thomas had always viewed me as an outsider, an unholy blemish on their family tree. They wanted the $1.2 million mansion and the investment portfolios, and they needed me completely erased to get it. Connor knew exactly how the American justice system treats black men accused of stealing from white institutions. He knew that a black man charged with robbing a conservative church charity and defrauding a dying man would be shown absolutely no mercy by a jury. He weaponized the deep systemic prejudices of his own federal agency to secure his place within Evelyn and Thomas's elite social circle. He sold my freedom and my life to appease his white relatives. He sacrificed me on the altar of their greed. The 2 federal agents sitting across from me mistook my silent shock for a confession of guilt. The lead agent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. "You look pale, Harrison," he said with a cruel grin. "It hits hard when you realize you are not the smartest guy in the room anymore, does it not?" You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You are going to die in a cage." I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into his eyes. My heart was completely shattered. A massive part of my soul, the part that held a father's unconditional love for his son, had just been brutally murdered. But as the grief settled into the deepest corners of my chest, a new, profound energy began to pump through my veins. The profound, devastating pain was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Connor thought he had executed the perfect crime. He thought his federal badge made him invincible. He thought because he was young and held a gun, he could easily outsmart an old retired man. He assumed that because I was grieving the loss of my husband, I would simply surrender and let the federal machine swallow me whole. But Connor made a fatal, catastrophic error. He forgot who trained him. He forgot who paid for his education. And most importantly, he forgot that before I was a grieving widower, before I was an adoptive father, I was a ruthless corporate executive who spent 3 decades hunting down financial predators. He used a federal database to build a fake paper trail, but he did not realize that I understood the architecture of that trail better than he ever could. I knew how to read the shadows behind the numbers. I did not say a single word to the agents. I did not proclaim my innocence again, and I certainly did not try to explain that my son was an FBI agent who had framed me. I knew these men would never believe me. To them, I was already guilty. I just stared at the forged documents burning every timestamp, every routing number, and every encrypted hash code into my memory. I let them feel like they had won. I let them pack up their folders and walk out of the room thinking they had successfully broken an arrogant corporate thief. I sat alone in the cold interrogation room, listening to the heavy iron door lock from the outside. My wrists still ached, and the thin cotton pajamas offered no protection against the freezing air, but I was no longer shivering. My mind was already 10 steps ahead, mapping out a labyrinth of legal and financial maneuvers. My son and my husband's family wanted to use the power of the federal government to bury me alive. But they were about to learn a very painful lesson. You do not bring fake documents to a knife fight with a master accountant. I was going to strip them of their wealth, their freedom, and their arrogant pride, and I was going to do it all completely by the book. The heavy iron door swung open with a loud metallic clank that reverberated through the barren holding cell. I sat on the rigid steel cot, my body wrapped in the thin, scratchy fabric of a federal-issue jumpsuit, shivering against the persistent chill of the concrete walls. For 48 hours, I had been locked inside this miserable gray box. During my initial hearing, I had expected to walk out on bail. I was a 65-year-old retired chief financial officer with deep ties to the Atlanta community and absolutely no criminal record. But the federal prosecutor, armed with the perfectly fabricated digital evidence my son Connor had planted, stood before the judge and painted me as a manipulative mastermind, hiding millions in offshore accounts. The judge slammed his gavel, deemed me a severe flight risk, and denied bail without a second thought. I was sent back to this cage, left to rot in the cold, while the people I had supported for decades plotted my total destruction. The shock of the violent midnight raid and the absolute horror of my son's betrayal had initially paralyzed me. But as the hours dragged on, the panic began to recede. My mind, trained over 30 years to dissect complex financial systems and survive the ruthless battles of corporate boardrooms, began to cut through the emotional fog. I knew Connor was a federal agent. I knew he possessed the security clearance to fabricate IP logs and forge my digital signature using internal databases. But I also knew Connor was not the architect of this conspiracy. He was merely the weapon. The true masterminds were the people who stood to gain the most from my sudden, convenient downfall. My thoughts were interrupted when a heavy-set guard struck his baton against the iron bars of my cell. He barked my last name and ordered me to step forward. He secured my wrists in heavy steel handcuffs and marched me down a long, sterile corridor that smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach and stale sweat. The guard told me I had a visitor. For a brief, foolish second, my heart leaped. I thought my attorney had finally broken through the bureaucratic red tape to see me. I thought there was a glimmer of hope waiting behind the doors of the visitation room. The guard led me into a stark contact room. It was a bleak, windowless space containing nothing but a solid metal table bolted to the floor and 2 hard chairs. Sitting in the chair opposite the door was not my lawyer. It was Thomas. Robert's brother sat there looking entirely out of place in a federal lockup. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and an expensive silk tie. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He looked like the absolute epitome of untouchable wealth and Southern privilege. He did not look like a man mourning the recent death of his brother. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. The guard removed my handcuffs, stepped outside, and closed the heavy door, leaving us alone in the suffocating quiet. I stood there rubbing the deep red indentations on my wrists, looking down at the man whose luxurious lifestyle I had personally funded for the better part of 2 decades. Thomas did not stand to greet me. He did not offer a single word of sympathy for my loss or my current situation. He leaned back in his hard plastic chair, crossed one expensive shoe over his knee, and stared at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. "Sit down," Harrison Thomas said, his voice smooth and dripping with arrogance. "We have a lot of business to conclude, and neither of us wants to spend more time in this filthy place than necessary." I pulled out the metal chair and sat down directly across from him. I kept my spine straight and my expression completely unreadable. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to demand how he could orchestrate this nightmare while the soil on his brother's grave was barely settled. But I knew any display of emotion would only feed his massive ego. I remained perfectly silent, waiting for him to reveal the depth of his trap. Thomas reached into his polished leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He placed them neatly on the metal table. He smoothed his manicured hand over the top page and then slowly slid the entire stack across the table until it rested right in front of me. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it deliberately on top of the papers. "Read it carefully," Thomas instructed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the cold steel. "But I will save you the trouble of translating the legal jargon. That is a permanent deed of transfer and a full relinquishment of assets. It explicitly signs over the $1.2 million estate to my mother, Evelyn, and myself. It also transfers total control of your domestic investment portfolios, your retirement accounts, and every liquid asset you currently possess. You are giving it all to us today." I looked down at the dense legal text. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his demand hit me like a physical blow. They had weaponized the federal government to raid my home, drag me out in my pajamas, and lock me in a concrete cage just so they could extort me for the wealth I had spent my entire life building. I slowly lifted my eyes and locked my gaze with Thomas. My voice was low and completely steady. "And why would I ever sign away the wealth I built with my own hands?" I asked him. Thomas laughed. It was a dry, mocking sound that echoed harshly off the concrete walls. He shook his head, looking at me as if I were a stubborn, ignorant child. "Because you do not have a choice, Harrison." Thomas smiled, leaning even closer. I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his skin. "You are sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison for defrauding a conservative church charity and stealing from a dying man. Do you have any idea what a jury is going to do to you? You are a black man accused of stealing from a beloved white congregation. They will not just convict you, they will bury you under the prison. I kept my eyes fixed on his. The fake evidence you created will not hold up in a real court, I said simply. I am a master accountant. I know the paper trail is forged. It does not matter what you know. Thomas snapped, his voice dropping into a vicious, hissing whisper. It only matters what the FBI says is true. And right now, the FBI says you are a thief. Connor made sure of that. He built a masterpiece of a case against you. He used his security clearance to plant every signature and generate every IP log perfectly. The federal prosecutor believes it, the judge believes it, and the jury will absolutely believe it. Thomas paused, letting the immense weight of his words settle over me. Then he delivered the ultimate crushing blow. Here's the deal, Harrison. You take that silver pen and you sign every single page of those documents. You give us the mansion, the portfolios, and the cash. You walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. If you do that, Connor will go back into the federal database tonight. He will corrupt the files. He will introduce reasonable doubt into the chain of custody. He will make the federal charges magically disappear by tomorrow morning. You will be a free man. You will be a broke man, but you will be free. I stared at him, absorbing the horrific reality of his offer. He was openly admitting to a massive, coordinated federal conspiracy. He was holding my life and my freedom hostage in exchange for my entire net worth. And if I refuse, I asked, my voice deadly quiet. If you refuse, Thomas said, his smile vanishing into a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then Connor proceeds with the prosecution. He will testify against you. My mother and I will testify against you. We will tell the court how you manipulated Robert in his final days. We will make sure you get the absolute maximum sentence. You will die in a federal prison, Harrison. You will take your last breath on a metal cot surrounded by strangers. The cruelty radiating from his eyes was absolute. He felt no remorse. He felt completely justified. I needed to understand the depth of his malice. I needed to hear him say it out loud. Why, Thomas, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured. For 30 years, I took care of this family. I paid for the roof over your head. I funded Robert's dreams. I treated Connor like my own flesh and blood. Why do you hate me this much? Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking at me as if I were a disgusting stain on his expensive suit. He let out a long theatrical sigh as if explaining something painfully obvious to an idiot. You really never understood your place in this family, did you? He said, his voice dripping with condescending venom. You thought, because you wore tailored suits and made a lot of money, that you were actually one of us. You thought buying us a house made you an equal. Robert was weak. He was a soft, bleeding heart who brought you into our lives, and we tolerated it because he loved you. We tolerated it because you were a very convenient checkbook. Thomas pointed a rigid finger at me, tapping the air with each vicious word. But you were never family, Harrison. You were never going to be family. We smiled at your dinners, and we cashed your checks, but we always knew exactly what you were. An arrogant outsider playing pretend. When Robert died, your usefulness expired. Did you really think we were going to let a black man walk away with our family's legacy? Did you honestly believe we would let you keep the estate while we begged for scraps? Connor is a smart boy. He realized very quickly where his true loyalties belonged. He belongs with his own kind. He belongs with us. As Thomas spoke those final devastating words, something inside of me fundamentally fractured and then immediately rebuilt itself into something entirely new. The crushing grief that had weighed me down since Robert passed away simply vanished. The agonizing sorrow of losing my adoptive son evaporated into the cold, stale air of the cell. The pain of being betrayed by the people I loved was completely burned away by a sudden blinding flash of absolute clarity. For 30 years, I had walked on eggshells around these people. I had swallowed their passive-aggressive insults. I had ignored their subtle racism. I had poured my hard-earned wealth into their pockets, foolishly hoping that one day they would see me as a human being. I had tried to buy their love and their respect. But sitting here looking at Thomas's smug, entitled face, I finally understood the profound truth. They were parasites. They were arrogant, cruel parasites who believed the universe owed them everything simply because of the color of their skin and the prestige of their congregation. They thought they could use the American justice system as their personal weapon to discard me like trash. They thought I was weak because I had been kind. The sadness was entirely gone. What replaced it was a boiling, righteous fury. It was a cold, calculating fire that pumped through my veins and sharpened my mind to a razor's edge. I was a man who had spent his entire life dominating corporate boardrooms. I had dismantled corrupt companies and destroyed hostile takeovers. I knew how to read contracts. I knew how to trace hidden money. I knew exactly how to destroy an enemy financially. I looked down at the towering stack of legal documents resting on the metal table. I looked at the silver pen. Then I slowly lifted my eyes and locked my gaze with Thomas. I did not blink. I let the corporate executive, the ruthless chief financial officer, rise to the surface. "Thomas," I said, my voice resonating with a dark, terrifying authority. "You made a very serious miscalculation today." Thomas frowned, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" "Pick up the pen and sign the papers." I reached out and picked up the silver pen. I held it between my fingers, feeling the smooth, heavy metal. Then I calmly tossed the pen over my shoulder. It hit the concrete floor behind me and rolled away into the dark corner of the room. "I am not signing anything." I told him, my tone absolutely frozen. "You can take your fraudulent deed and your extortion attempt and you can burn them." Thomas slammed his fist down on the metal table, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of red. "Are you insane, Harrison? Did you not hear a single word I just said? Connor will bury you. You will die in prison. You have no way out of this." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, invading his space. "You think you are the predators in this scenario," I whispered, staring directly into his soul. "You think because Connor has a badge, and you have a country club membership, that you hold all the cards. But you know absolutely nothing about the money you are trying to steal. You know nothing about the corporate structures I built to protect my assets. You and Evelyn and Connor are nothing but greedy amateurs playing a game you do not understand." Thomas stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the concrete. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You arrogant fool," he spat. "I offered you a way out. I offered you mercy. But now we are going to take it all. We will drain every account you have to pay for the civil lawsuits. We will leave you with nothing. You are going to die in a federal cage, Harrison. You are going to die alone and forgotten." Thomas snatched the thick stack of legal documents off the table, shoving them roughly into his leather briefcase. He turned around and slammed his fist against the heavy iron door, signaling the guard to let him out. As the door buzzed and swung open, Thomas looked back at me one last time. His eyes were filled with venom and a sickening sense of triumph. "Enjoy your cell," he snarled before stepping out into the hallway and disappearing from view. The heavy door slammed shut, locking me inside once again. The deafening echo filled the small room, but I did not flinch. I sat at the metal table, perfectly still, breathing in the cold air. Thomas thought he had just delivered my death sentence. He thought his terrifying ultimatum had sealed my fate. But as I sat there in my orange jumpsuit, A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They wanted my $1.2 million estate. They wanted my portfolios. They wanted my life. They had successfully provoked the most dangerous version of me. The grief was gone. The battle lines were drawn. I was going to use every shred of my intellect, every ounce of my financial genius, and every hidden trap I had ever built to completely annihilate the Sterling family. They wanted a war over my wealth. I was going to give them a massacre. The heavy iron door of the visitation room slammed shut. I was alone again in the freezing holding cell. Thomas had walked out believing he had me completely trapped. He thought I was just a grieving old black man who would crumble under the weight of the federal justice system. He thought my son Connor had successfully frozen every single asset I owned. They had seized my checking accounts. They had frozen my retirement funds. They had put a lock on the joint accounts I shared with my late husband, Robert. They wanted me destitute and desperate. They wanted me begging for mercy. But Thomas and Connor made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I spent over 30 years as a chief financial officer for a global logistics firm. In the corporate world, you learn very quickly that you never leave yourself without an exit strategy. You never put all your resources into a system that someone else controls. Long before Robert got sick, I had set up a private offshore emergency trust. It was a completely legal blind trust located in a jurisdiction that the federal government could not immediately touch without a mountain of international court orders. I built that trust to protect Robert and me from sudden market crashes. Connor did not know it existed. Thomas did not know it existed. It was my invisible shield. I walked over to the small metal phone attached to the wall of the holding area. I picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the number for my private attorney. His name was Marcus, and we had fought many corporate battles together. When he answered, his voice was frantic. He had been trying to find out where they took me. I stopped his questions and gave him one simple instruction. I told him to access the blind trust and post my bail immediately. I told him to bring a car to the federal detention center. Less than 3 hours later, a guard walked up to my cell and unlocked the iron door. He looked confused. He told me my bail had been posted in full and I was free to go. I did not smile. I did not say a word. I simply changed back into the clothes they had taken from me the night before and walked out of that facility. Stepping out into the warm Atlanta morning air, I took a deep breath. The sun was shining brightly, but my soul was covered in ice. Marcus was waiting by his car. He offered to drive me anywhere I wanted to go. I told him to take me home. I needed to go back to the scene of the crime. When we pulled up to my driveway, the sight of my house almost brought me to my knees. The beautiful front door was splintered and hanging off its hinges. Yellow police tape was plastered across the porch. I thanked Marcus for the ride and told him I needed to be alone. I ducked under the tape and walked inside. The destruction was absolute. Connor and his federal agents had torn my life apart. They had slashed the upholstery on the sofas. They had ripped family photo albums apart. They had smashed the vases Robert loved so much. It was a physical manifestation of their hatred for me. They wanted to erase my presence from this home. I walked through the debris, my footsteps crunching on broken glass. I felt a heavy ache in my chest, but I refused to let any tears fall. Tears would not bring Robert back, and tears would not put Thomas and Connor in a federal penitentiary. I needed evidence. I knew Connor had fabricated the digital trail to frame me for embezzling Robert's pension and the church charity. But I also knew Robert. Robert was a deeply trusting man, but he was not naive. He knew his mother Evelyn and his brother Thomas were greedy. He knew they constantly looked for ways to exploit his success. For years, Robert kept his business affairs strictly separated from his family. I made my way down this hallway to Robert's private home office. The door had been kicked in. The agents had tossed every single file cabinet. They had taken his desktop computer, his external hard drives, and all his paper ledgers. The room looked like a hurricane had ripped through it. They thought they had confiscated everything of value. But they did not know Robert the way I knew him. Robert had a habit he picked up from me early in our relationship. Always keep a backup that nobody else knows about. Always have a physical copy hidden away from the digital networks. If Thomas and Evelyn were desperate enough to orchestrate this massive federal raid, they were hiding something huge. They were hiding something that they feared I would discover as the legal executor of Robert's estate. I stood in the middle of the wrecked office, closing my eyes and trying to channel my husband. Where would you hide the truth, Robert? Where did you put the backup? I opened my eyes and looked at the heavy oak bookshelves lining the back wall. The agents had pulled all the books down, leaving the shelves bare, but they had not moved the heavy wooden structure itself. I walked over to the corner of the room. My 65-year-old joints popped and ached as I dropped down to my hands and knees. I crawled along the edge of the baseboard, where the bookshelf met the hardwood floor. I ran my fingers along the wooden trim, pressing firmly against the grain. I moved slowly, breathing in the dust that hung in the air. I reached the far right corner behind the heavy base of the bookshelf. I pressed my thumb against a small section of the wooden baseboard. It shifted. It gave way just a tiny fraction of an inch. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I dug my fingernails into the tiny gap and pulled. A 6-inch piece of the wooden baseboard popped completely off, revealing a small, dark cavity carved into the drywall. I reached my hand inside the dark hole. My fingers brushed against a small velvet pouch. I pulled it out, holding it in the palm of my hand. The pouch was heavy and covered in a thick layer of dust. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the effort. I walked over to the large window, letting the morning sunlight hit the pouch. I opened the drawstrings and turned it upside down. A sleek silver flash drive fell out into my hand. This was it. This was the ghost of my husband reaching out from the grave to save me. I walked into the guest bedroom, where I kept an old offline laptop in my travel bag. The agents had ignored the travel bag because it was packed with old clothes and shaving kits. I pulled the laptop out, plugged it into the wall, and turned it on. I inserted the silver flash drive into the side port. The screen flickered and a single folder appeared on the desktop. It was labeled simply with my name, Harrison. My hands shook as I clicked on the folder. Inside there were 2 subfolders. One was labeled Audio Diaries and the other was labeled Estate Ledgers. I opened the audio folder first. There were dozens of voice recordings dating back over the last 2 years. I clicked on the most recent file dated just 3 days before Robert suffered his fatal heart attack. The room filled with the sound of my husband's voice. It was weak and raspy, heavily affected by his failing health, but it was undeniably Robert. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of him wash over me. It felt like he was sitting right next to me in the room. Harrison, my love, the recording began. If you are listening to this, it means my heart finally gave out. It means I am gone, and you are alone. I am so deeply sorry for leaving you to deal with this mess. I did not want to burden you with my family's ugly secrets while you were taking care of me. But you need to know the truth. You need to know what Thomas has done. I leaned closer to the computer, staring at the audio waveform moving across the screen. My brother Thomas is not a successful businessman, Omir's voice continued, sounding incredibly tired. He is a fraud. 3 years ago, his investment firm went completely bankrupt. He lost everything. He came to me begging for a loan to save his reputation. I told him no. I told him I would not risk our future to pay for his gambling in the stock market. But Thomas found another way. He manipulated my mother, Evelyn. He convinced her to help him use the family estate as collateral. I paused the recording for a second, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Robert was saying. The $1.2 million mansion that I had paid for in full. The house where Thomas and Evelyn currently lived like royalty. I pressed play again. Thomas used the estate to secure massive high-risk offshore loans. Robert explained, his voice trembling with anger. He forged documents to make it look like the property was unencumbered. He took out over $2.5 million in illegal toxic loans from unregulated private equity groups. He pumped all that money into a commercial real estate deal that completely collapsed 6 months ago. Thomas is drowning in debt, Harrison. The lenders are threatening to seize the estate. They are threatening to take everything. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind, creating a crystal-clear picture of pure evil. Thomas and Evelyn did not just hate me because I was a black man in their elite white family. They did not just want to erase me from Robert's legacy. They needed me out of the picture because they were completely broke. If I remained the executor of Robert's estate, I would inevitably audit the property. I would discover the massive liens on the house. I would expose Thomas for the criminal he truly was. Robert's voice faded back in coughing slightly before continuing. I found out about the loans last week. I confronted Thomas. He begged me not to tell you. I told him I was going to cut him off entirely. I told him I was going to the bank to legally sever our estate from his toxic debt. I was going to evict them and sell the house to cover the mess he made. I was going to do it on Monday. But my chest hurts so much today, Harrison. I feel so weak. If I do not make it to Monday, you have to protect yourself. Thomas will come after you. He will try to force you to sign over your assets to cover his illegal debts. Do not let him win, my love. You are the smartest man I have ever known. Destroy him. The recording ended, leaving me in a deafening silence. I sat staring at the computer screen, my chest heaving, with deep, powerful breaths. Robert was preparing to cut his greedy family off completely. He was going to save us from their financial ruin. But his heart failed before he could sign the paperwork. And the moment he died, Thomas and Evelyn knew their time was running out. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a checkbook. They went to Connor. They poisoned my adoptive son against me. They told Connor that I was planning to steal his inheritance. They told him I was a greedy outsider who had manipulated Robert. And Connor, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my love, chose their white elite status over his black father. Connor used his FBI badge to fabricate the embezzlement charges against me. He orchestrated the midnight raid to lock me in a federal cell. They wanted to terrorize me into signing away my entire net worth so Thomas could pay off his $2.5 million toxic debt and save the family mansion. I opened the second folder labeled Estate Ledgers. It was a treasure trove of financial destruction. Robert had meticulously saved copies of every single fraudulent loan document Thomas had signed. He had bank routing numbers, offshore account details, and communication logs between Thomas and the private equity lenders. It was undeniable hard proof of massive financial fraud and federal wire violations. My hands were no longer shaking. The cold, freezing terror I had felt in the holding cell was completely gone. The sorrow of losing Robert was still there, but it had been transformed into a hardened weapon. Thomas, Evelyn, and Connor thought they had outsmarted a retired old man. They thought I would cower in a corner and surrender everything I had worked 30 years to build. They wanted my money to cover their crimes. They used my son to put me in chains. I looked at the silver flash drive glowing softly in the side of the laptop. This was not just a piece of evidence. It was a loaded gun, and I was going to point it directly at the foundation of their entire existence. I was going to let them think they had won. I was going to let them celebrate my defeat. And then I was going to pull the trigger and watch their arrogant, entitled world burn to the ground. I sat in the dim light of the guest bedroom staring at the silver flash drive sticking out of my laptop. The silence of the house was absolute, but a roaring storm was raging inside my head. I had the proof. I had Robert's audio diaries and the estate ledgers. I had the digital fingerprints of my own son fabricating federal evidence against me. A younger man, a more naive man, might have taken this laptop straight to the local police precinct. He might have walked up to the front desk demanding justice and waving these files around. But I am a 65-year-old black man in the Deep South. I survived corporate America by knowing exactly how the system operates and exactly who it protects. I knew the local police precinct was deeply entwined with the local federal field office where Connor worked. If I handed this evidence to a local detective, it would inevitably cross Connor's desk within the hour. The files would accidentally be deleted. The flash drive would go missing in the evidence room. I would be locked up in a psychiatric ward for making false statements against an FBI agent. I was not going to play their game on their turf. I needed to go above their heads. I needed to strike where Connor had no friends and no influence. I spent the next 4 hours sitting at that small desk, compiling a master dossier. I cross-referenced Connor's fabricated IP logs with the genuine estate ledgers Robert had left me. As I worked, the shock of my son's betrayal transformed into a cold, methodical precision. Connor had been arrogant. He assumed an old, retired executive would not understand the intricacies of cybersecurity or federal auditing software. But he forgot that I spent a decade managing supply chain logistics and cyber compliance for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I knew exactly what to look for. I mapped out the metadata tags on the fake wire transfers. I highlighted the encrypted hash protocols Connor used to fake my digital signature. I created side-by-side comparisons, proving that the transactions were physically impossible. I documented every discrepancy with brutal clinical accuracy. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a chief financial officer dismantling a hostile takeover. Once the digital evidence was perfectly organized, I turned my attention to the delivery method. I could not simply send an email. I needed guaranteed, uncorrupted delivery to the highest authority possible. I packaged the files onto 3 separate encrypted physical drives. I drafted a comprehensive 30-page executive summary detailing the exact timeline of the extortion, the midnight raid, the forged documents, and the specific federal statutes my son had violated. I addressed the package to the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General in Washington, D.C. The Inspector General is the internal watchdog of the federal government. They do not care about local politics. They do not care about country club memberships. Their sole purpose is to hunt down and prosecute corrupt federal agents. They are the apex predators of the Justice Department. I drove to a 24-hour shipping center 2 towns over just to ensure I was not captured on any local surveillance cameras. I paid for priority overnight shipping using a prepaid card. As I handed the thick sealed envelope to the clerk, I felt a profound sense of shifting momentum. Connor thought his federal badge made him a god in Atlanta. But by tomorrow morning, the true gods of the Justice Department would have his digital fingerprints under a microscope. I was not just filing a complaint. I was launching a federal investigation that would strip him of his badge, his freedom, and his arrogant pride. But putting my son in a federal prison was only half of the equation. I still had to deal with Thomas and Evelyn. They were the true architects of this nightmare. They were the ones who sat in the front row of Robert's funeral and called my 30-year marriage a trivial, unholy sham. They were the ones who pushed Connor to betray me because they desperately needed my wealth to save their elite status. I drove back to my ransacked home as the sun began to rise over the Georgia pines. I brewed a pot of black coffee and opened the second folder on Robert's flash drive. The estate ledgers. Robert had meticulously documented the catastrophic financial mess his brother Thomas had created. I pored over the spreadsheets analyzing the toxic offshore loans Thomas had taken out, using the $1.2 million family estate as collateral. Thomas was a terrible businessman. He had leveraged the family mansion to borrow $2.5 million from a ruthless, unregulated private equity firm based out of the Bahamas. The commercial real estate venture he invested in had completely collapsed. The private equity firm was currently bleeding him dry with exorbitant interest rates. They were preparing to foreclose on the mansion and liquidate the asset. Thomas was absolutely desperate. That was why they needed my domestic investment portfolios. They needed my cash to pay off this predatory loan before the bank threw Evelyn out onto the street. I sat back in my chair, sipping the bitter coffee, letting a beautiful, dangerous strategy take shape in my mind. Thomas wanted my money to save his house. He was willing to destroy my life to get it. But Thomas did not understand how the shadow world of distressed debt truly operated. He did not realize that debt could be bought, sold, and weaponized. I picked up my phone and called a man named Richard. Richard was a ruthless corporate liquidator I had worked with extensively during my days in the logistics sector. We had dismantled bankrupt competitors together. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he owed me a massive favor for steering a lucrative merger his way a decade ago. I woke him up at 6 a.m, but when I explained the situation and gave him the name of the private equity firm holding Thomas's debt, Richard was wide awake. I instructed Richard to reach out to the Bahamian firm on my behalf. I told him to use the funds from my hidden offshore emergency trust to purchase Thomas's distressed loan in its entirety. Private equity firms holding toxic debt are always looking to offload bad investments for pennies on the dollar. They want quick liquid cash. I authorized Richard to offer them a premium buyout using my hidden corporate funds. It took less than 48 hours of aggressive international wire transfers and aggressive negotiations. By Wednesday afternoon, Richard called me back with a confirmation number. The transaction was complete. The Bahamian private equity firm had officially sold the $2.5 million promissory note. Thomas and Evelyn had no idea. They thought they were still dealing with an anonymous offshore bank. They did not know that the debt had been reassigned. I was now the sole owner of the toxic loan tied to their precious $1.2 million estate. I was their hidden creditor. I literally owned the financial sword hanging over their heads, but I was not simply going to foreclose on them. Foreclosure was too easy. Foreclosure would just make them victims. I wanted them to hang themselves with their own insatiable greed. I needed them to aggressively demand the property from me. I needed them to take legal ownership of the estate, believing they had successfully stolen it from a defeated black man. I contacted my personal attorney, Marcus, and instructed him to draft a very specific property transfer agreement. It was a complex document designed to look like a complete surrender of my assets. On the surface, it stated that I was yielding the $1.2 million mansion to Evelyn and Thomas free of charge. But buried deep within the third appendix, under layers of dense corporate legal jargon, was a toxic loan guarantee clause. This clause explicitly stated that whoever signed for the deed assumed absolute personal liability for any and all encumbrances attached to the property. If Thomas signed that paper to steal the house, he would legally transfer the entire $2.5 million debt directly onto his own Social Security number and Evelyn's personal estate. They would not just be taking a house. They would be swallowing a financial hand grenade. I was no longer fighting for my freedom. I was weaving a magnificent invisible noose. I printed the transfer documents and placed them in a neat stack on my desk. I was finally ready. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I sat at the dark mahogany desk in my home office staring at the phone. The physical trap was perfectly set. The documents were drafted, printed, and stacked neatly in a leather folder. Now I just needed the rats to take the bait. I picked up the receiver and dialed Thomas's number. I let it ring 3 times before he answered. His voice was sharp, impatient, and dripping with the kind of unearned authority that always made my stomach turn. I closed my eyes and let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally changing my posture to alter the tone of my voice. When I spoke, I made sure my words trembled just a fraction. I told him he had won. I told him I was too old and too tired to fight the federal government. I said the thought of dying in a prison cell terrified me far more than losing the money. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a low, cruel chuckle. Thomas did not offer an ounce of grace or sympathy. He simply told me that it was about time I realized my place in the natural order of things. He instructed me to meet them on Sunday morning at their church. He said they wanted to handle the transfer of the estate on holy ground before the morning service, so they could sit in their family pew, knowing the legacy was finally cleansed of my presence. I agreed and hung up the phone. A cold smile stretched across my face in the empty room. They wanted to do this in the house of God. I thought it was incredibly fitting. They were about to learn a very biblical lesson about pride coming before a fall. Sunday morning arrived with a bitter chill in the air. For 30 years, I had always taken immense pride in my appearance. As a black man navigating the highest levels of corporate Atlanta, I knew that my armor was a perfectly tailored suit, a crisp collar, and a flawless tie. But today I was not putting on my armor. I was putting on a costume. I chose a suit that was a decade old and slightly too large, making me look frail and shrunken. I left my collar unbuttoned. I did not polish my shoes. I spent a long time looking in the mirror, practicing the exhausted, hollow-eyed stare of a man who had lost absolutely everything. When I pulled my car into the massive parking lot of their megachurch, I felt a deep wave of revulsion. The building was an architectural monstrosity of glass and steel designed to look more like a billionaire's corporate headquarters than a place of humble worship. The parking lot was filled with imported luxury sedans and expensive sports cars. Families dressed in designer clothes walked past me without a second glance. To them, I was invisible. I was just an aging black man with slumped shoulders walking slowly toward the administrative wing. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked down a wide hallway lined with portraits of the church founders. The air conditioning was freezing, and the thick plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I was walking into the absolute center of their power, but my heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. I was a Trojan horse carrying the instrument of their total destruction right through their front doors. The receptionist directed me to a private conference room at the end of the hall. I gripped the brass handle, took a shaky breath to stay in character, and slowly opened the door. The room was opulent. There was a massive polished oak table in the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Sunlight poured in through a large stained glass window, casting colorful shadows across the room. Thomas sat at the head of the table looking like a king presiding over his court. Evelyn sat to his right, wearing a severe black dress and pearls, her face set in a mask of pious judgment. And leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed over his chest was my adopted son, Connor. He was not wearing his neat federal suit today. He wore a casual polo shirt and slacks, looking entirely too relaxed for a man who had just framed his father for federal felonies. When I walked into the room, Connor did not stand up. He did not greet me. He simply looked me up and down and let a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at me the way a hunter looks at a wounded animal that has finally stopped running. It took every single ounce of my willpower to keep my hands from balling into fists. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy I had taught how to drive, how to shave, how to tie a necktie. I looked at him and realized there was absolutely nothing left of the son I loved. He was entirely consumed by the toxic entitlement of his biological relatives. I slowly pulled out a chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down, keeping my eyes lowered to the polished wood. No one offered me a cup of coffee. No one offered a word of comfort for the husband I had just buried a few weeks ago. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. Evelyn was the first to speak. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was laced with a venomous condescension that cut right to the bone. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me as if I were a stain she was finally wiping away. She told me that I should be on my knees thanking the Lord for their boundless mercy. She said any other family would have let me rot in a federal penitentiary for what I allegedly tried to do to Robert's estate. I sat there in silence, absorbing her vicious lies. She knew I had not stolen a single dime. She knew Connor had fabricated the entire federal case. But in her mind, the truth did not matter. In her mind, I was a usurper. She went on to explain that Robert was a deeply confused man who had strayed from the righteous path by bringing me into their bloodline. She said my 30 years of devotion, my financial support, my absolute loyalty meant absolutely nothing. I was a financial parasite who had latched onto her son, and today she was finally curing the infection. She told me that the $1.2 million estate was a symbol of their family legacy, and it was a sheer travesty that my name had ever been associated with it. She demanded that I show some gratitude that they were allowing me to walk away a free man. I listened to every hateful word she spoke. I let her ego swell to the size of the room. I kept my head down, playing the part of the humiliated, defeated old man perfectly. I forced a small tremor into my hands as I reached into my battered leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick stack of real estate transfers and legal relinquishments I had my attorney draft. I slid the massive bundle of papers across the polished oak table toward Thomas. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and tapped it against the documents. He did not even bother to read the fine print. He was too blinded by his own arrogance to suspect that a broken man could set a trap. He simply flipped to the signature pages in the back. Connor finally pushed himself off the wall and walked over to the table. He stood right behind my chair, looking down at me. "You are doing the right thing, old man," Connor said, his voice low and mocking. "As soon as you hand over the keys and walk out of this church, I will make a quick phone call. The digital evidence against you will develop a sudden chain of custody error. The federal prosecutor will drop the case by tomorrow morning. You get to keep your freedom, and we get our family back. Everybody wins." I looked up at Connor for a brief moment. I wanted to ask him how he could sleep at night. I wanted to ask him how much a soul costs in this modern world. But I knew it was a waste of breath. I looked back down at the papers. I knew exactly what was buried in Appendix C on page 42. I knew that the specific legal language of the transfer bound the new property owners to a toxic loan guarantee. I knew that by taking the title to that mansion, Evelyn and Thomas were legally assuming the $2.5 million offshore debt that Thomas had desperately tried to hide. I had purchased that debt. I was their creditor. And the moment they signed those papers, they would be handing me the legal right to completely liquidate their entire existence. I picked up my own cheap plastic pen. My hand hovered over the signature line. Thomas watched me like a hawk, his breathing shallow with anticipation. I let out a long, trembling sigh for dramatic effect. Then I pressed the ink to the paper. I signed my name, releasing my claim to the beautiful estate I had purchased decades ago. I signed away the investment portfolios. I signed away the liquid cash accounts. I flipped page after page, signing my name 24 separate times. With every stroke of the pen, I was severing the toxic ties that bound me to these people. But more importantly, with every stroke of the pen, I was locking the doors of the burning building they were standing inside. When the last page was signed, I slowly pushed the stack back across the table. Thomas snatched the documents with lightning speed. He quickly scribbled his own signature on the receiving lines and then handed the pen to Evelyn. She signed her name with a triumphant flourish. It was done. The legal transfer was absolute. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a loud breath of profound relief. The massive financial weight that had been crushing him for 6 months was gone. He thought he had successfully stolen my wealth to pay off his criminal debts. He looked at me with a wide, victorious grin. "Now hand over the keys, Harrison." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass keys to the estate. The keys to the home where Robert and I had shared our lives. I placed them gently on the oak table. The metal clinked loudly in the quiet room. Evelyn reached out and pulled the keys toward her, holding them against her chest, as if she had just won a holy crusade. "You can show yourself out, Harrison," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "Do not ever contact this family again. Do not come to this church. Do not drive past our home. You are a ghost to us now." I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table, as if my legs could barely support my weight. I looked at Thomas, who was busy organizing his newly stolen documents. I looked at Evelyn, who was clutching the brass keys. And finally, I looked at Connor, who was already typing a message on his phone, likely contacting his federal associates to wipe the fake servers clean. They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They truly believed they had conquered the world. I buttoned my slightly wrinkled suit jacket and picked up my empty briefcase. I did not say a single word. I simply turned around and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. My footsteps were completely silent on the plush carpet. I walked out of the conference room and out of their lives, playing the role of the defeated old man right up to the very last second. But as the heavy church doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sight of their celebrating faces, I finally allowed myself to stand up straight. I rolled my shoulders back, releasing the tension I had been carrying for days. I walked out into the bright Sunday morning sunlight and pulled my phone from my pocket. I sent a single text message to my attorney and another to the Inspector General investigator I had been corresponding with all weekend. The text contained only 2 words: trap sprung. I stood in the bright parking lot of that massive church, letting the warmth of the Sunday morning sun wash over my face. I had just walked out of the lion's den. I had played the part of the broken, defeated old man perfectly. They had swallowed the performance without a single drop of hesitation. I pictured Thomas sitting inside that opulent conference room right now, rubbing his hands together over those signed documents. He probably thought he was the smartest man in the entire state of Georgia. He thought he had just bullied me into handing over a $1.2 million estate, absolutely free and clear. He thought he had won the war. But what Thomas did not know was that the very second his silver fountain pen scratched across the bottom line of that contract, he sealed his own absolute destruction. Let me tell you exactly how a master financial officer sets a trap for a greedy predator. When I instructed my attorney to draft those transfer documents, I made sure we did not just hand over a simple deed. I structured the transfer under a very specific limited liability company umbrella. Thomas was so blinded by his arrogance and his desperate need to secure the mansion that he completely ignored the intricate corporate jargon buried deep in the third appendix. By signing his name and having his mother Evelyn sign as the co-guarantor, they did not just take ownership of the house. They legally assumed full personal liability for the $2.5 million in toxic corporate debt that was tethered directly to the property. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they were forcing me into a corner. But I was the one who had quietly purchased that distressed debt from the offshore private equity firm. I was their hidden creditor. They had literally just signed a legally binding federal document transferring $2.5 million of inescapable high-interest debt directly onto their own personal Social Security numbers. If they ever wanted to sell the house, they had to pay me. If they wanted to keep the house, they had to pay me. And because they had absolutely no liquid cash left, they were completely and utterly trapped. They had wrapped a financial noose tightly around their own necks and practically begged me to kick away the chair. I walked slowly to my car, listening to the distant sound of the church choir singing hymns through the thick, stained glass windows. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was staggering. Evelyn and Thomas had just committed the ultimate sin of greed right inside their place of worship. They had used my grieving heart against me. They had manipulated my adopted son to turn against the man who raised him. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, and today justice was wearing the suit of a retired black executive who refused to become a victim. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the reality of the moment settle deep into my bones. For 30 years, I had fought for a seat at the table. I had endured the quiet racism, the polite smiles that hid sharp daggers, the constant feeling that I was only tolerated because I was funding their luxurious lifestyle. My late husband, Robert, had seen through them in the end. He knew what they were capable of, and he had left me the hidden flash drive to ensure I could defend myself. I looked up at the rearview mirror, making eye contact with my own reflection. The tired, slumped posture I had carried into the church was completely gone. The man looking back at me was strong-focused and ready to watch the empire fall. Suddenly, the silence of the car was broken by the sharp buzzing of my cell phone resting in the cup holder. I looked down at the screen. It was an incoming call from a Washington, D.C. area code. My heart did a slow, powerful thump against my ribs. I had mailed the master dossier full of Connor's fabricated digital evidence to the Department of Justice office of the Inspector General just 48 hours ago. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button, bringing the receiver to my ear. I took a deep breath and simply said hello. Mr. Harrison, the voice on the other end was deep professional and completely all business. This is Special Agent Miller with the Office of the Inspector General. We received your package yesterday morning. I am calling to inform you that we have completed our preliminary forensic verification of the IP logs and the digital signature files you provided. I remained perfectly still, holding my breath. The entire outcome of my freedom depended on what this man said next. The Inspector General is the internal watchdog that hunts down corrupt federal agents. They are the apex predators of the Justice Department. If they believed my son's fabricated evidence, I would be spending the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary. Your analysis was entirely accurate, Mr. Harrison. The agent continued, his voice carrying the heavy weight of federal authority. We cross-referenced the metadata tags from the wire transfers used to charge you with embezzlement. Our cyber division confirmed that the data packets were generated using an internal encrypted software program restricted exclusively to active FBI personnel. The footprint traces back directly to your son's federal credentials. He used his top-secret clearance to illegally access the banking network and plant your digital signature. A massive wave of profound relief washed over me, so powerful It actually brought tears to my eyes. The heavy, suffocating terror of the false federal charges that had been hanging over my head for days instantly shattered. Connor had tried to bury me, but he forgot that digital records always leave a shadow. He had weaponized his badge against a black man, thinking no one would ever question his authority. But he underestimated the absolute precision of a seasoned corporate auditor. "What happens now?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady, despite the emotional storm raging inside my chest. Agent Miller did not hesitate. "The avalanche has already started, Mr. Harrison. 10 minutes ago, Connor's federal security clearance was permanently revoked. His access to all federal databases has been completely severed. He is currently considered a rogue agent. The charges against you are being formally dropped and completely expunged as we speak. You are a free man with a completely clear record. But more importantly, the United States Attorney has just issued a federal arrest warrant for your son. He is being charged with perjury evidence tampering cyber fraud and the illegal use of a federal database to frame a civilian. Our field agents are actively moving to apprehend him." I closed my eyes as the words echoed through the quiet cabin of my car. An arrest warrant. The boy I had raised, the boy I had loved with every fiber of my being, was about to lose everything. He had thrown away his entire future, his prestigious career, and his freedom just to appease the racist, greedy demands of his grandmother and his uncle. He had chosen their toxic white privilege over the unconditional love of his black father. Now he was going to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system he had so arrogantly tried to manipulate. "Thank you, Agent Miller," I said, my voice thick with a mixture of immense gratitude and deep fatherly sorrow. "I appreciate your swift action." "We do not tolerate corruption in our ranks, Mr. Harrison," the agent replied firmly. "Your son disgraced his badge. He will face the absolute maximum penalty under the law. We will be in touch regarding your formal testimony." "Good day, sir." The line went dead. I lowered the phone to my lap and sat in the quiet car for a long time. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely obliterated the enemy. Inside that church, Thomas and Evelyn were probably still celebrating their brilliant victory. They were probably making plans to renovate the kitchen or buy new luxury cars with the money they thought they had stolen from me. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to violently collapse around them. Within the next 24 hours, Thomas was going to receive a certified letter from my attorney. The letter would formally inform him that his $2.5 million offshore debt had been legally acquired by a private holding company. My holding company. The letter would demand immediate payment in full as per the acceleration clause buried in the property transfer he had just signed so eagerly. When he realized that he had personally guaranteed millions of dollars in toxic debt, and that I was the one holding the collection note, his arrogant smile would permanently vanish. He would be forced to sell the family estate just to avoid total bankruptcy. I was going to take the house Robert and I had built right out from under them and leave them with absolutely nothing. And Connor. Connor was going to walk out of that church feeling like an untouchable king. He would walk to his expensive car, smug and confident, thinking he had successfully sent an innocent man to prison. But when he turned the key in the ignition, he would be greeted by the flashing red and blue lights of his own federal colleagues. He would be dragged out of his vehicle, stripped of his weapon, and thrown into the back of a transport van wearing federal handcuffs. He would be locked in the exact same freezing holding cell where he had tried to leave me to die. I started the engine of my car and slowly pulled out of the massive church parking lot. I did not look back at the towering stained glass windows. There was no need. The past was finally dead, and the future was entirely mine. I merged onto the highway, driving back toward the city of Atlanta. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, burning away the morning chill. I felt lighter than I had felt in years. The pain of Robert's death would always remain a tender scar in my heart. But I knew that wherever he was watching over me with a profound sense of pride. He had given me the weapon I needed to defend myself, and I had wielded it with absolute perfection. I had protected our legacy, I had defended my honor, and I had proven that a man's worth is not measured by the color of his skin or the false prestige of his family name. A man's worth is measured by his intelligence, his resilience, and his unwavering commitment to the truth. Let this be a warning to anyone who thinks they can prey on the grieving or exploit the vulnerable. Let this be a lesson to those who believe their social status or their government badges from consequences. Greed is a poison that blinds the mind and corrupts the soul. Thomas, Evelyn, and Connor thought they were invincible. They thought they could manipulate the system to crush a 65-year-old black man. But they forgot that I helped build the very systems they tried to use against me. I did not just survive their vicious attack. I turned their own greed into a weapon, and I watched them destroy themselves. The financial predator they had foolishly awakened was now fully satisfied, and the scales of justice were finally perfectly balanced. I sat inside the quiet cabin of my car with the engine turned off, watching the heavy mahogany doors of the megachurch, and knowing that the absolute destruction of my arrogant in-laws was only seconds away. The morning sun was climbing higher over the towering glass and steel architecture of the elite sanctuary. The parking lot was filling up rapidly with expensive luxury sedans and imported sports cars. The wealthy congregation was arriving for the main Sunday service. Men in tailored suits and women in expensive designer dresses walked past my vehicle without a single glance. They were completely oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon their pristine community. I kept my eyes fixed on the administrative wing. Inside that building, Thomas and Evelyn and my adopted son Connor were currently celebrating. They thought they had just executed the perfect extortion. They thought they had legally stolen my $1.2 million estate and stripped me of every dime I had earned over my 30-year career in corporate America. They believed they were invincible because of their status and their skin color and their federal badges. But they had no idea that I had already triggered the trap. I simply sat there, breathing in the cool air of the morning, feeling the deep, heavy satisfaction of a man who knows that true justice is only moments away. The grief of losing my husband, Robert, was still a dull ache in my chest, but the righteous fury of a father betrayed had taken total control of my mind. I was not going to leave this parking lot until I saw the absolute destruction of their arrogant facade. The peaceful Sunday morning atmosphere shattered exactly 10 minutes later. The sound of heavy tires screeching against the asphalt echoed across the expansive parking lot. I watched as 5 massive black government sport utility vehicles turned sharply off the main road and accelerated directly toward the front entrance of the church. They did not use their sirens, but the aggressive speed and the dark-tinted windows screamed of federal authority. The vehicles aggressively swerved to a halt, blocking the main entrance and the administrative wing doors completely. The wealthy churchgoers who were casually strolling toward the sanctuary suddenly froze in their tracks. Their polite conversations stopped instantly. They stared in absolute shock as the doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. More than a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and heavy tactical vests poured out onto the pavement. Across their backs in bright yellow letters were the acronyms for the Office of the Inspector General and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. These were not local police officers who could be bought with a country club membership or swayed by a polite Southern smile. These were the apex predators of the Federal Justice Department. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision. There was no hesitation in their steps. They were here for a specific target, and they were not going to let anyone stand in their way. I slowly opened my car door and stepped out onto the pavement. I wanted to witness this with my own two eyes. I wanted to feel the vibration of the moment. I leaned against the side of my car, watching the lead agent direct his team. It was Agent Miller, the man I had spoken to on the phone just a short while ago. He was a tall, commanding presence who radiated absolute authority. He signaled for two agents to secure the perimeter while he led the main strike team straight up the concrete steps toward the heavy mahogany doors of the church. The congregation parted like the Red Sea. Wealthy businessmen and local politicians who normally walked with an air of absolute superiority stepped back nervously, clutching their leather-bound Bibles. They whispered frantically to one another, trying to comprehend why armed federal agents were invading their sacred space on a Sunday morning. The panic in their eyes was a beautiful sight. For decades, this church had been a fortress of privilege for people like Evelyn and Thomas. It was a place where they looked down on outsiders and judged anyone who did not fit their pristine, wealthy narrative. They used their religion as a shield for their greed. But today that shield was being violently ripped away. I slowly followed behind the agents, keeping a safe distance but ensuring I had a clear view of the grand foyer inside the administrative wing. The grand foyer of the church was a massive open space with high vaulted ceilings and a floor made of polished Italian marble. A giant crystal chandelier hung from the center, casting fractured light across the room. Dozens of elite church members were gathered near the sanctuary doors, chatting and sipping gourmet coffee. Just as Agent Miller and his heavily armed team breached the main entrance, the heavy wooden doors of the private conference room at the end of the hall swung open. Thomas walked out first. He was puffing his chest out, smiling a wide, arrogant smile and laughing at something Evelyn had just said. He was holding the thick leather folder containing the property transfer documents I had just signed. He held it tightly against his side like a prized trophy. Evelyn walked right beside him wearing her severe black dress, clutching the brass keys to my estate in her hands. She looked incredibly smug, her chin raised high as if she had just conquered the world. Connor walked a few steps behind them, casually checking his phone, probably verifying that his digital tracks had been cleared from the FBI database. They looked like the perfect, untouched, aristocratic family. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into a federal ambush. When Thomas looked up and saw the wall of tactical federal agents marching across the polished marble floor, his arrogant laughter died instantly. His face went completely pale. Evelyn stopped dead in her tracks, dropping her expensive handbag to the floor with a loud thud. The entire grand foyer went completely silent. The murmurs of the congregation vanished. The only sound in the massive room was the heavy rhythmic thud of the agent's tactical boots striking the marble. Connor looked up from his phone and his eyes widened in sheer panic. But Connor was arrogant. He had been trained to believe that his badge made him a god. He thought he could control any situation. He took a quick step forward, placing himself between his uncle and the approaching strike team. He puffed out his chest and reached into his pocket, pulling out his leather credential case. He flipped it open to display his gold FBI shield. He held it high in the air, trying to project an aura of federal brotherhood. He commanded the agents to stand down. He stated his name and his rank and demanded to know who the officer in charge was. He actually tried to use his corrupt authority to stop the office of the Inspector General. It was the most pathetic display of unearned privilege I had ever seen in my entire life. Agent Miller did not slow his pace. He marched directly up to Connor, stopping less than 2 feet away. He looked at the gold shield in Connor's hand, and then looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. Agent Miller did not whisper. He spoke in a loud, booming voice that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and reached the ears of every single wealthy church member standing in the foyer. He told Connor that his federal security clearance had been permanently revoked as of 0800 hours this morning. He told Connor that he was officially a disgrace to the Bureau. Agent Miller reached out and physically snatched the leather credential case right out of Connor's trembling hand. Connor gasped, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. The golden boy of the family, the untouchable federal agent, was suddenly stripped of all his power in front of his entire community. Agent Miller then ordered 2 heavily armed officers to secure the suspect. They moved in instantly, grabbing Connor by the shoulders and spinning him around violently. They slammed him face first against the polished oak wall of the foyer. The sound of his body hitting the wood made Evelyn scream loudly. Connor struggled for a brief second, but the agents shoved his face harder against the wall. They grabbed his wrists and pulled them forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the silent room. I watched as Agent Miller stepped closely behind Connor and began to loudly recite his Miranda rights. He did not spare him a single ounce of dignity. He announced the charges for the entire congregation to hear. He charged Connor with federal perjury evidence, tampering cyber fraud, and the illegal use of a classified government database to frame an innocent civilian. He told him he was being arrested for orchestrating a malicious federal conspiracy. Connor was sobbing now. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic tears of a boy who finally realized his actions had real devastating consequences. He begged Agent Miller to listen to him. He stammered that it was a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to protect his family. But nobody was listening to his lies anymore. The wealthy congregation watched in absolute horror as the young man they had praised and admired was humiliated, stripped of his weapon, and paraded through the church foyer like a common street criminal. The agents pulled him away from the wall and marched him toward the exit. As Connor walked past me, his tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. He looked at me, pleading silently for help, but I did not offer him a shred of sympathy. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, and my face completely blank. I let him see the cold, calculating executive he had foolishly tried to destroy. I watched him being dragged out the glass doors and shoved into the back of a black SUV, exactly like they had done to me just days prior. But the Sunday takedown was far from over. While Connor was being hauled away, a second team of agents stepped forward. These men and women wore jackets identifying them as the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They surrounded Thomas and Evelyn, who were now trembling uncontrollably near the conference room door. Thomas tried to straighten his suit jacket, trying desperately to regain his country club composure. He put on his best fake Southern smile and told the lead IRS agent that there must be some sort of terrible mistake. He tried to explain that they were upstanding members of the community and that they had just concluded some private family estate business. He actually held up the leather folder containing the property transfers, as if it proved his innocence. He had no idea that he was holding the very instrument of his own financial execution. The lead IRS agent did not smile back. He looked at Thomas with absolute disgust. He reached into his own tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of official federal documents stamped with bright red seals. The agent loudly announced that he was executing an immediate federal asset seizure. He explained for the entire congregation to hear that Thomas had fraudulently used the family estate as collateral to secure $2.5 million in illegal high-risk offshore loans. The agent stated that because Thomas had just formally signed the legal transfer documents, assuming full personal liability for the estate, he was now personally, legally responsible for the entire toxic debt. The private holding company that owned the debt had initiated an immediate acceleration clause due to federal fraud. The IRS was stepping in to freeze and seize all of Thomas's assets to satisfy the massive criminal liability. Thomas dropped the leather folder to the marble floor. The papers spilled out, scattering across the polished stone. His knees buckled and he had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing completely. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man. Evelyn began to wail. It was a loud, piercing sound of pure, aristocratic panic. She clutched her pearl necklace, falling to her knees right there in the middle of the grand foyer. She screamed that they were being robbed. She demanded that the church elders do something to stop this outrage. She looked around at the faces of her wealthy friends, her elite social circle, pleading for someone to intervene. But nobody moved. The congregation stepped further away, looking at Thomas and Evelyn with pure, unadulterated judgment. The untouchable, elite facade they had maintained for decades was completely shattered into a million pieces. They were exposed as broke, desperate frauds who had resorted to criminal extortion to maintain their lavish lifestyle. The people they had tried so hard to impress were now looking at them like they were toxic waste. The IRS agents began handing Thomas a barrage of legal notices, formally stripping him of his bank accounts, his vehicles, and his properties. They told him he had 24 hours to vacate the $1.2 million mansion before the federal locks were placed on the doors. He was officially homeless and millions of dollars in debt. I stood near the entrance, watching the entire scene unfold with a deep, profound sense of peace. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales. They had brought me to this church to humiliate me and to steal my life, but instead, they had orchestrated their own spectacular public execution. I did not need to yell. I did not need to curse them or make a scene. My intellect and my patience had done all the heavy lifting. I watched Thomas hyperventilating against the wall and Evelyn sobbing on the marble floor. The true financial predator within me was finally completely satisfied. I turned around and walked out of the church, breathing in the fresh, warm Atlanta air. The heavy weight of the past 30 years was finally gone. I was walking away a free man, leaving them to burn in the inferno of their own making. If my story touched your heart today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next stories. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It brings a lot of joy to this father's heart to know where you are keeping me company. 2 exact weeks had passed since that unforgettable Sunday morning at the church. 2 weeks since the federal government stormed through those heavy mahogany doors and completely shattered the pristine, untouchable illusion of the Sterling family. I was sitting at a quiet corner table in a small local coffee shop, miles away from the upscale, gated neighborhoods where Thomas and Evelyn used to parade their inherited wealth. I had a warm cup of black coffee in my hands and a profound sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The morning sun was streaming through the large glass window, casting a bright golden glow across the wooden table. For the first time in 30 long years, I was not checking my phone for frantic, demanding messages about his family's latest financial disaster. I was not calculating how much of my annual corporate bonus I would have to sacrifice to keep his mother draped in luxury. I was simply breathing. I was finally completely free. The news over the past 14 days had been nothing short of biblical. My personal attorney, Marcus, kept me updated on every single glorious development. Connor was currently sitting in a maximum security federal lockup, wearing the exact same itchy orange jumpsuit he had so maliciously forced me to wear. The federal judge presiding over his arraignment had taken one single look at the undeniable digital evidence compiled by the Office of the Inspector General and denied him bail immediately. Connor was deemed a severe flight risk and a dangerous threat to the integrity of the Justice Department. He was spending his days and nights in a freezing concrete box, stripped of his badge, stripped of his arrogant smirk, and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The former colleagues he had tried to impress had completely turned their backs on him. He was a disgraced rogue agent. Meanwhile, his uncle Thomas was drowning in a financial abyss of his own making. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had moved with terrifying speed. They had frozen every single bank account tied to Thomas and Evelyn. They had seized his luxury vehicles, his country club memberships, and every hidden domestic asset he possessed. Thomas was entirely ruined. The $2.5 million toxic offshore debt he had recklessly acquired was now entirely his personal legal burden because of the property transfer he had so eagerly signed. The Bahamian private equity firm was relentlessly demanding their money, and because I was the hidden entity who had purchased that distressed debt, my legal team was methodically tightening the financial noose. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. The small brass bell above the coffee shop door chimed loudly, cutting through the quiet, gentle hum of the morning crowd. I did not look up right away. I was reading the morning newspaper, enjoying my quiet solitude. But then I heard the sound of frantic, heavy footsteps rushing across the wooden floorboards. The footsteps were erratic, desperate, and loud. I slowly lowered my newspaper and looked up. Standing just a few feet away from my table was Evelyn. The sight of her was absolutely jarring. For 3 decades, I had only ever seen my mother-in-law looking like a flawless portrait of Southern aristocracy. She always wore immaculate designer dresses, perfectly tailored suits, and expensive pearl necklaces. Her hair was always professionally styled to absolute perfection. She carried herself with an air of untouchable superiority, looking down her nose at anyone who did not belong to her elite social circle. But the woman standing in front of me today was a broken, shattered shell of her former self. Her gray hair was uncombed and wildly disheveled, hanging loosely around her pale face. She was wearing a wrinkled, oversized sweater and a pair of faded sweatpants that looked like they had been pulled straight out of a laundry hamper. There was absolutely no makeup on her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, swollen, and underlined with dark, heavy bags that spoke of countless sleepless nights. She was visibly trembling, and her chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She was hyperventilating right there in the middle of the quiet coffee shop. Evelyn stood there staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The few other patrons in the coffee shop stopped talking and turned to look at the frantic, disheveled woman causing a massive scene. I did not move. I did not invite her to sit down. I did not offer her a glass of water. I simply placed my hands flat on the table and looked at her with an absolute calm, calculating silence. I waited for her to speak. "Harrison," she gasped, her voice cracking and breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Harrison, please. I have been looking everywhere for you. I drove around for hours hoping to find your car. Please, you have to listen to me." She took a stumbling step forward, clutching the edge of my table with her shaking hands to keep her balance. "They took everything, Harrison," she sobbed uncontrollably. "The federal agents came to the house yesterday morning. They served us with the final eviction notices. The bank is seizing the entire estate. They told us we have 48 hours to pack our bags and vacate the premises. Thomas has absolutely nothing left. His accounts are entirely frozen by the government. The high-priced lawyers will not even answer our phone calls anymore because we cannot pay their massive retainer fees. Our friends at the church have completely turned their backs on us. We have nowhere to go. We are going to be thrown out onto the street. We are going to be homeless, Harrison." I watched a single tear roll down her wrinkled cheek, followed by another and another. She was crying real tears of absolute desperation. The untouchable elite matriarch, who had commanded so much power and respect, was completely broken. Her community had abandoned her the moment the illusion of her wealth was shattered. Then she did something I never in my wildest dreams thought I would ever witness. Evelyn, the proud, arrogant woman who had despised me for 30 years, simply because I was a black man who dared to love her son, collapsed to her knees right there on the dirty wooden floor of the coffee shop. She fell to her knees in front of the very man she had tried to destroy. She grabbed the hem of my suit jacket with her shaking hands, sobbing loudly for the entire room to hear. She completely abandoned all her precious pride. "Harrison, I am begging you," she wailed, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the cafe. "I know you have money. I know you have massive offshore accounts and retirement funds from your corporate days. You are the only one who can fix this disaster. You have to pay off the toxic debt. You have to save the house. Please use your money to stop the bank from taking my home. You cannot let them do this to me. We are family, Harrison. Robert would have wanted you to help us. Please, we are your family." I looked down at her kneeling on the floor, clutching my clothes. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words hung in the air. She was actually trying to invoke the sacred name of my dead husband, the man whose beautiful memory she had publicly desecrated just weeks earlier. I searched my heart for an ounce of pity. I searched for a single drop of compassion or forgiveness. But the grief and the anger that had fueled me for the past month had completely burned away, leaving behind a profound, icy calm. It was the absolute clarity of a man who had successfully dismantled his greatest enemy and reclaimed his life. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my jacket. I stood up from my chair, towering over her kneeling, fragile form. The entire coffee shop was dead silent, watching this powerful moment unfold. I looked down into her tear-filled, terrified eyes, and I spoke with a voice as cold and hard as solid steel. "You stood at my husband's grave and called my 30 years of unconditional love a trivial sham," I said my words, slicing through the quiet air. "You stood in front of your entire congregation and tried to completely erase my existence. You manipulated my adopted son. You let him put me in heavy steel handcuffs. You let him drag me out of my home in the middle of the night and lock me in a freezing concrete cage. You were perfectly happy to let me die in a federal prison so you could steal my hard-earned wealth." Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but I raised my hand and stopped her immediately. "You are not my family, Evelyn," I stated with absolute finality. "You never were. You made your choice when you signed those papers at the church. You wanted the grand estate. You wanted the pristine family legacy. Well, now you have it. Keep the house. Keep the massive debt." I picked up my morning newspaper and my car keys from the table. I did not look back down at her. I simply stepped around her kneeling, shaking body. I walked straight toward the coffee shop door, my footsteps echoing firmly against the wooden floorboards. I could hear her sobbing uncontrollably behind me, a pathetic wailing sound of a woman who had finally realized she had completely destroyed her own life through her own toxic greed. I pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the warm, bright Georgia morning. The sun hit my face and the fresh air filled my lungs. I walked to my car feeling lighter and more powerful than I had ever felt in my entire life. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Sterling family was finally completely severed. They were ghosts in my rearview mirror, and I was driving forward into a beautiful, quiet future that belonged entirely to me. Sometimes in life, the people who demand the most from you are the ones who respect you the least. They will take your love, your money, and your endless sacrifices, and they will still look down on you. But you must never let them break your spirit. You must stand tall, use your intelligence, and remember your own true worth. True justice is not about yelling or fighting with your hands. It is about staying perfectly calm and letting the greedy destroy themselves with their own traps. If this story touched your heart today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It brings a lot of joy to this father's heart to know which corner of the world is listening to me and what time of day it is for you. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom watching the judge look down from his elevated wooden bench. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday morning, and the air inside felt incredibly heavy with consequence. My adopted son Connor was standing before the judge wearing the exact same dull orange jumpsuit I had been forced to wear just months prior. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that clinked loudly with every small movement he made. He looked so incredibly small and defeated. The arrogant federal agent who had proudly used his badge to destroy a black man was completely gone. In his place was a terrified boy facing the absolute ruin of his entire life. The federal judge did not hold back a single ounce of his fury. He spoke at length about the sacred trust placed in federal agents and the horrific, unforgivable abuse of power Connor had committed by fabricating digital evidence to frame an innocent civilian. When the judge brought his heavy wooden gavel down, he sentenced Connor to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. 12 long, agonizing years with absolutely no possibility of early parole. As the armed marshals grabbed his arms to lead him away, Connor turned around and looked back at me one last time. His eyes were welling with tears, begging for mercy, begging for the father who used to fix all his mistakes. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at him with the calm, steady eyes of a man who had survived his ultimate betrayal. He had made his choice to side with greed, and now he had to walk through the fire he started alone. The federal justice system handled Connor perfectly, but the financial trap I set completely annihilated Thomas and Evelyn. 2 weeks after the raid at the church, the sheer brutal reality of their greed finally crushed them. Thomas was entirely bankrupt. His bank accounts were frozen, his credit was destroyed, and his elite high society reputation was turned to absolute ash. Because they had foolishly signed the property transfer, assuming the toxic $2.5 million offshore debt, they lost absolutely everything. I drove past the sprawling $1.2 million estate one last time to witness the end of their era. A massive red foreclosure sign was hammered deeply into the pristine green front lawn. I parked my car across the street and watched as the local sheriff deputies physically escorted Evelyn and Thomas out of the front door. Evelyn was wearing a faded gray housecoat, clutching a single cheap rolling suitcase. All her expensive designer clothes, her sparkling pearl necklaces, and her prestigious country club memberships were gone. They had all been seized by the federal government to pay the creditors. Thomas looked like a broken, hollow old man. His shoulders were completely slumped, and his face was pale and defeated. They stood alone on the concrete sidewalk, waiting for a cheap taxi to take them to a budget motel, because absolutely none of their wealthy church friends would even answer their phone calls anymore. They were completely cast out of the high society they thought they ruled. They had looked down on me for 30 years, treating me like a walking checkbook, simply because of the color of my skin. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and leave me to rot in a cell. Instead, they stripped themselves of their own humanity and ended up with absolutely nothing. A few days later, I received an official thick envelope from the Department of Justice. It contained a formal letter from the Office of the Inspector General, officially and completely clearing my name of all fabricated charges. I was completely exonerated. The dark cloud that had been hanging over my head was finally lifted, and I could breathe freely once again. With my name cleared and my enemies vanquished, I realized I could no longer stay in the city of Atlanta. The sprawling city was filled with far too many ghosts. The high-stakes corporate world, the massive glass buildings, the upscale restaurants, they all felt incredibly hollow and meaningless to me now. I wanted absolute quiet. I wanted genuine peace. I sold the remaining properties, I liquidated the domestic asset portfolios, and I took my wealth down south. I bought a beautiful, sprawling piece of land deep in the heart of rural Georgia. It sits at the very end of a long dirt road surrounded by towering green pine trees and ancient weeping willows. I built a modest, comfortable house with a wide, wraparound wooden porch where I can sit in my favorite rocking chair and listen to the crickets sing as the golden sun goes down. The air out here is sweet and clean. There are no wailing sirens, no stressful corporate meetings, and absolutely no toxic people pretending to be my family. The people in this small town treat me with genuine respect, not because of my bank account, but because I am a good neighbor. I wake up every single morning long before the sun rises, brew a strong pot of black coffee, and walk out onto my porch to watch the white mist roll off the tall grass. For the first time in 30 years, my shoulders are completely relaxed. The profound, icy stress that I carried deep in my bones has finally melted away. I survived the corporate sharks, and I survived the ultimate betrayal, and I came out the other side with my soul completely intact. I found a place where I can simply be a man without having to constantly prove my worth to people who refuse to see it. But I knew I could not just sit quietly on my wealth. Robert and I had worked far too hard to let our legacy just gather dust in a quiet bank account. I took the millions of dollars that Evelyn and Thomas had tried so desperately to steal, and I created a permanent foundation. I started the Robert and Harrison Educational Trust. Every single year, we provide massive full-ride college scholarships to marginalized African American youth across the entire southern United States. We find young, brilliant black men and women who have the intellect and the incredible drive but completely lack the financial resources to step through the door. We pay for their tuition, we pay for their books, and we make sure they have everything they need to succeed in this world. I take the money that was originally meant to fund the endless greed of an entitled white family, and I use it to build generations of black excellence. Every time I sit at my desk and sign a new scholarship check, I think about Robert. I miss my husband every single day. I miss his warm laugh, and I miss the beautiful way he always saw the absolute best in people. But I sleep incredibly soundly every single night, knowing I fiercely protected our legacy from the vultures who tried to devour it. I often look out over the vast green fields and realize that true wealth is not measured in sprawling mansions or hidden offshore accounts. True wealth is measured by the peace you carry in your heart and the positive impact you leave behind for others. I took their bitter hatred, and I successfully transformed it into a powerful beacon of hope for the next generation. My journey taught me the most valuable lesson a man can ever learn. You can never buy genuine respect, and you can never change the hearts of people who are determined to look down on you. But you can outsmart them. You can maintain your profound dignity. You can use your sharp intellect to build an impenetrable fortress. They thought my deep love was a fatal weakness. They thought my heavy grief made me an easy target. But I survived the terrible storm, and I proved that quiet dignity and sharp intellect will always outlast selfish entitlement and bitter cruelty. I am finally a free man, living completely on my own terms, and nobody will ever take that away from me again. If my story resonated with your heart today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories. Tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes this old father incredibly happy to know which beautiful corner of the country or the world is listening to my voice and what time of day you are keeping me company. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my journey. May you always find the courage and strength to rise above darkness in your life. Always protect your peace, protect your legacy, and walk with your head held high. Looking back on this entire nightmare, I realized a fundamental truth about human nature. Blood absolutely does not define loyalty, and wearing a tailored suit or a shiny federal badge certainly does not make someone an honest person. My own adopted son and my late husband's relatives thought they could strip me of my dignity simply because they believed their status made them untouchable. They smiled politely while spending my hard-earned money, but behind closed doors, they viewed me as nothing more than a convenient checkbook. I want you to hear this loud and clear. Never let anyone belittle your sacrifices. Never let anyone make you feel like you are less than equal just because you do not fit their narrow, prejudiced view of the world. And most importantly, never let greedy people mistake your kindness for weakness. I gave them my love and my resources for 30 years, and they repaid me with the ultimate betrayal. But I did not break. I used the very intelligence and resilience that built my success to completely dismantle their wicked conspiracy. Sometimes you do not even need to fight your enemies with your fists or your shouting. Sometimes you just have to step back. Stay perfectly calm and let people dig their own graves with the exact same shovels they originally brought for you. They wanted to bury me, but instead they buried themselves under the weight of their own insatiable greed and arrogant entitlement. Now they have absolutely nothing, and I have reclaimed my peace. I hope my story serves as a powerful reminder to always trust your instincts and always stand up for your own worth. Do not ever let anyone silence your voice. If my journey today resonated with your heart, please hit that like button to support a father who refused to surrender and fought back against the darkness. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss these true life stories that I share with all of my heart. I want to build a community where we can all learn and heal together. Tell me down in the comments what state or what country you are watching from right now and exactly what time it is there. I read every single comment, and it brings this old man so much profound joy to know exactly where my voice is reaching across the world. Knowing that you are listening and keeping me company makes my days infinitely brighter. If you have ever faced a massive betrayal or had to fight for your own dignity, please share your experience down below so we can uplift one another. We are all walking this path together, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Stay incredibly strong, protect your peace at all costs, and I will definitely see you in the next life story. Thank you so much for watching my video today. With all my love and deepest respect to all of you.